Okay.
Okay, we are on Hey base. We are on 5B1. Um, just to recap, the Gemara spoke about Rav Oven said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if somebody placed his hand into someone else's property, and somebody was standing in public property, and he received or collected, that's going to be the question, rain, and he places it in public property, we say that the person is chayav. The person who collected the rain, it was raining, and the Gemara originally thought he caught rain, and then the Gemara speaks about not that he caught it, because he caught it means he didn't uproot it. Rather he was more active in collecting the rain, and the Gemara said that he would be in violation if he takes the rain out and places it in public property. And the Gemara was trying to understand what's the case talking about. Good morning, Simon. That he is in violation. What's the circumstance? So the Gemara said that he gathered the water from the wall. The Gemara said it was raining, and there was coming down the wall, and he gathered from the face of the wall as it was coming down. He gathered it from the face of the wall, the front of the wall. So the Gemara had the question, but it's not resting. In order for a person to be chayav on Shabbat, he has to take an item that's resting and pick it up. But if the water is coming down the wall and you put your hand there and you catch the water, or you take it, you put your hand to take the water that's coming down the wall, you did not. The water wasn't resting. So therefore, if it's not resting, you cannot be obligated for uprooting something unless it's resting. So the Gemara wanted to say we're talking about the wall is slanty, it's on an angle, and therefore you caught some of the water because the wall is sticking out, let's say over here, and the water's coming down, you're able to catch some of the water. And the Gemara is thinking that's called resting. And the Gemara is going to question that. And the Gemara says we found such a situation where we said that by the wall rest being on a slant, the item is resting. And the Gemara said, where was that story where water was found on the side? Not water, something that the wall was on a slant, and as a result of that, the item was sloping wall. That the item that was considered the item that was resting on the wall resting. So the Gemara said the case was, and we're up to the second case on 5B, 5B1A is Hayakori Berosh Agag. If a person was Simon, it's 5B1. If a person was reading a sefer, he was on top of the roof. Many roofs today, rooftops, right? We have a rooftop grill. People have things that go on the roof. It's a flat roof. So he was reading a sefer when he was sitting on top of the roof. He was reading a scroll, and the sefer we're talking about is a scroll similar to our Megillat Esther type of scroll, and he was reading it, and what happened was, and one end of the Megillah, let's say, morning, Boker Tov, one end rolled to over the the top of the wall, and it rolled into public area, public property. Was your house is on one side of the street, and the other outside your house was public property. It was facing public property. Let's say someone would be going on the roof of the building here, and the scroll was going over into the airspace, over the building into the airspace of the public property. So we say, if the sefer did not reach, if the scroll did not reach within 10 tfachim of the ground, let's say 10 tfachim is about 40 inches or so, 37 inches, whatever it is, to find out exactly what it is, 30, 35, 37. It's so as long as the sefer, so obviously the roof, so most roofs are going to be more than 10 tfachim. Most roofs are more than 40 inches from the ground. So as long as, right, so but the question is how big of a scroll was he reading, right? If he was reading a large scroll, it could extend very far. So, something could have a scroll with written all the Tanakh. So if it did not reach, if the scroll did not reach within 40 inches of the ground, let's say, so then go lo etzlo. The man on top of the roof could go ahead and roll the scroll to him. He could roll the other end to where he is, and that's not in violation. There's no problem for him to roll it to where he is. Now, because as we know, the space over 10 tfachim, that space higher than 10 tfachim is considered a mokum patur. It's considered an area that's exempt. And since it's considered an area that's exempt, so the rabbis instead, because even if the whole item fell into a mokum patur, even if a whole item fell into an exempt area, there's no problem to carry from a mokum patur, a certain type of area, to a public property, or from mokum patur, an exempt area, to private property. So there's no problem here. The scroll that he's holding on top of the roof, which is a private property, if the scroll is hanging over into public property, but the fact that it's not within the airspace, that's a problematic airspace, was it higher than 10 tfachim from the ground, so therefore he's allowed to roll it to him. However, if the scroll, if the Megillah, or let's say this large written scroll, came all the way down, he's still holding in one end, but it reached within 10 tfachim of the ground, so we say he's not allowed to roll it to him. We say he can't roll it to him because what's the reason? Because if it's true, he's holding on to one end, right? He's holding on to an end, but if the whole item would have fallen from his hands, right. This is very good. Simon says no akira. He's holding on to it. That's true. But the rabbis were concerned if you allow him to roll the other end to him while he's holding on to it, Simon, maybe he's going to take the whole thing and bring it to him when he dropped it. If you allow him, once it's in the airspace of public property, real public property airspace, because it's within 10 tfachim of the ground, within 40 inches of the ground. So if you're going to go ahead and allow him to roll it to him when he's holding on to it without the akira, he might actually do a real akira and uproot it when it actually fell onto the ground, public property, and bring it. Because he says, listen, it was over public property, and I was able to roll it to me. See, what's the difference if it actually fell from my hand or not? He might not make the difference. He's not such a learned person like you to say, here you did not make the akira.
Instead of picking it up, just going to roll it back.
But if he rolls it back, the concern is if you allow him to roll it back once it reached the public property, he might come to roll it back, even though it's in his hand, he might come to roll it back when it's totally out of his hand. So you're right, Simon. On paper, he should be able to roll it back. There's no problem because he's holding on to it. So on a Torah level, there is no problem. But the rabbis are here to protect that people should not come to violate the Torah. So therefore, the rabbi said that he should not roll it back once it reached within the real public airspace. That would be a problematic airspace. So what should he do? Now, if the side of the reading that you read from, right here, this is the side that we read from, and this is the side that we don't read from. So let's say it's plain white parchment on this side, empty. So what he does is, it's not respectable that this will be hanging over, leaving it something hanging like this. Good morning, Asaf. So what does he do? He's allowed to turn it over. He could turn, when he's on the roof, he could turn the item over, but he can't roll it to him. The reason why he turns it over, so instead of the written side facing the public, which is not so respectful, that you have a scroll with writing, Torah writings, which is hanging in midair. No, so it's not on the ground. He's holding on to it. He's on the roof. He's holding on to it. But instead of it being exposed with the tav, with the written side facing the public, just hanging from midair, he just turns it. And therefore, the empty side will be facing the public. So that's what Ella Zahofcho alaktav. He turns it over. Vavinaba in the Gemara in Eruvin was wondering about this law. The Gemara says, "Amai hofcho alaktav." Why does he have to turn it over and leave it suspended until after Shabbat? Holonoch. It did not rest. The top that fell into the ear of Rishut Rabim did not rest. Since it's suspended in midair, right? So suspended in midair, it's not resting. So so we should be lenient and we should say that he should be able to roll it back. Number one, like Simon said, he didn't make that. It's by him. He's holding on to one end. And number two, it's not even resting. Meaning the prohibition of the Torah to take an item from one domain to another domain is only if the item was resting on a specific spot. And if you uproot it from where it's resting, that's where there's a violation. But an item that's hanging in air, it's not considered like it's resting in that domain, right? An item that's hanging, if I'm standing on public on the roof, and it's hovering over and it's hanging in the air in private over public property, it's not resting in public property because it's hanging in the air. And so therefore, even if I would go ahead and if I would bring that item from that area into another area, it was not violating Torah law because I did not uproot it from where it's resting. Since that's the case, so when one end is hanging in public property and the other end he's holding on to, the rabbis should allow you to roll it to yourself. Why? Because there's no concern. What's the problem? Because the rabbis are concerned you might come to make a biblical prohibition, right? What are the rabbis trying to protect us from a biblical prohibition? So even if, what are we afraid? Maybe the whole thing will fall out of his hand into the air, and he will bring it back to him, right? But even if the whole thing falls out into the air and he brings it back, if he catches it before it fell into public property, if he catches it and when he brings it to the roof, he's not violating Torah law. So let's say he's holding on to it now. So what are we afraid? It'll slip out of his hand. He'll drop the end that he's holding on to, and then now he goes in and he'll pull it to himself, right? Not that he dropped listen, if he dropped and it falls down, it falls actually into public property. We're not afraid that he's going to if he's on the roof, if it actually will land on the ground, he's not going to be able to pull it back to him because it's already on the ground. So what is more of the concern is if it falls out of his hand while it's hovering over public property, Jack. he might come to pull it or catch it. You drop something and you catch it. Even if he catches it and then he pulls it to himself, he's not a violation of the Torah because when he caught it while it was hanging over public property and hanging over. If you're on one domain, if you're on private property, and something is in your hand is in another property, or the item is in another property, that's not called resting. The same way, if I'm standing in this property, if I'm in public property, if the poor man is in public property, he puts his hand and he extends his hand into private property, and the balabayit places something in his hand, that's not called resting. If he moves his hand out, that's not called an akira. The akira would be if he put his hand in private property and he picked it up from private property. But if someone placed in his hand, that's not called uprooting. It's not called that his hand is resting. So therefore, like the Gemara said before, the hand is always moving. So therefore, what's the issue? Why are we concerned? Why do we forbade you to pull that safer that's hovering over public property when you're standing on the roof? Why do we forbade you? Because even if you let go and you pull it back, it wouldn't be a biblical violation because the item is not resting. Now, so that's the Gemara. That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara says, and what did the Gemara say in Eruvin? Holonach. Gemara's Amarava Bikosa Meshupa. We're talking about a roof that's on top of a wall, that the wall is not exactly straight. The wall is on a slant, it's on a slope, and the top of the sefer is, and the end of the sefer of the scroll is resting on that slope. Because it's resting on that slope, it's considered resting. Because if, let's say, you're on top of the roof, and here's the roof, and the sefer falls down on this over here, so it's considered resting. It's resting on a surface. So too, the Gemara wants to say, and now that it's resting, so it's actually resting, and this wall is in public property, right? So it's true that the roof is private property, but the wall, the space this surface of the wall isn't public. So if it's within 10 tvachim of the ground, that has a status of public property, and therefore, if you would go ahead and let go, meaning if your hand would let go, it's resting. It actually is resting in public property. So therefore, we're afraid if you let go, then you actually will be pulling from public property to private property because it is considered resting. So therefore, even though you didn't let go, you're still holding on to it. So you're technically not making an akira. You're not violating the Torah law because it's already in your hand where you are in private property. So you're not making an akira. You're not uprooted from public because you're still holding on to it. But we make the gzeirah. The rabbis say that if you allow him to pull it back when it comes within 10 tefachim, within 40 inches of the ground, he might pull it back even when it left his hand, and he'll be actually doing a biblical violation because the item is resting. So the Gemara wants to say maybe we could explain Rabbi Yochanan's words of the rain. When we're talking about the rain was going down over a slanted, a sloping wall, and they rested on that wall, and then you went ahead and you picked up the rain from that wall. And therefore that's called, you uprooted something that it was actually resting. But then the Gemara says, and the Gemara challenges that. The Gemara says, Ema the Amar Rava, maybe Rava said his law, b'sefer. Specifically by a sefer, that type of item doesn't move. It's not like rainwater coming down. The ovelanayich, a sefer is common that it will rest on that wall, on that slope. But how could you say with rainwater that's coming down over a slopey wall, Mayim miavidi denaichi is, water doesn't just rest on that slopey wall. Water rests if you place water in a receptacle in a utensil. But therefore, but the rain is obviously going to be going down the wall. Because going down the wall, it's not considered resting. Good morning, Asaf. So how is it that you could say that how could Rabbi Yochanan say that you are violating Shabbat if a chayav, which would actually be if he does it unintentionally, he will be obligated to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering. But the rain would never. When you stood in public property and you entered your hand into private property, but the rain was not resting. So therefore, you never made an akira. You never uprooted the rain. So therefore, that's the Gemara's question. Elam Rava. So Rava says you have to explain when Rabbi Yochanan talks about the rainwater, you got the case all wrong. You got to know what the case is. This is the case talk. This is the case. We are now on 5B1, the right side, but a third down. If you want the Gemara's over there.
Okay.
Elam Arava. We had rainwater. There was water in a pit. Let's say you had water in a pit, and then the rain came into that pit, 5B1, and the rain now the water now was on top of that water. And now you have a nice pit of water, and it's filled all the way up to the top. So if a person is standing in public property and he goes ahead and he collects, then he takes his hand, he sticks his hand into his neighbor's property. Again, he's in public property. He sticks his hand in someone else's private property, which the guy has a water pit, and he takes some of the water from the pit and he takes it out and he places it in public property. So he took water. So here the water is not moving. It's not rain going down a wall. The rain is already collected in this pit. So then the Gemara says, if that's the case, then it's obvious. If the water is collected in a pit, if the rainwater is in a pit, right? That's how they make, most probably they made a mikvah, right? They would dig a ditch, and then the rain would collect in it. Mikveh is from the word mikveh, kavu hamayim, gathering of water. So if they would go ahead and you take the water from this pit, so it's obvious you are violating Shabbat because the water is obviously resting in this pit. The water is not going anywhere. It's not moving anywhere, right? And you took the water from private property, this your friend's courtyard, and you moved it into public property. You placed it down in public property. So there is a akira, an uprooting, and an halacha, right, Simon? So therefore, the Gemara said we don't need Rabbi Yochanan to tell us that law. It's Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have to tell us something that's obvious, right? The job of the rabbi in the Gemara is not to tell us that 1 + 1 is 2, right? He's here to tell us something that we don't know, that we might not have known. We might not have known this. So therefore, that's the Gemara's question. The Gemara says, "Guma pshita." That word pshita means it's obvious. It's obvious. There's no need for the rabbi to tell me something that everybody would know. Pshita. So the Gemara says the following. It's not so simple. I mean, that's what the Gemara is going to respond. Because what's the case talking about? It's not talking about water that's inside a pit. Rather, water that's over the pit. Which would be let's say you have a pit that's filled up with water to the top. And then you have an extension, the rim. You have an extension, that water that goes a little high. You ever see like on a cup of wine, right? You can have it to the cup, there's the top. Then you have there's some other, you could still get it above, you could get a little wine that's even higher than the actual rim of the cup, right? There's a little, it's hanging, it doesn't have the walls of the cup holding it. So therefore the Gemara says, Mayim al gabi mayim morning. So the Gemara says, Mahodetema, you might have thought, Mayim al gabe Mayim lav hanachahu. You might have thought that the top water that's on top of the lower water is not considered resting because that water that's above moves a little bit, has a little movement in it because it's not inside the pit. So therefore, you might have said that that water that's above the the rim of the pit, maybe that water is considered not resting. So therefore, Kamash Malan, that even the top water is also considered as if um, it's resting. So this is how that's how the Gemara wants, and the Gemara says, you see, I'm explaining the Gemara. See, I'm explaining the Gemara that we're referring to this this layer of water that's hovering above, because since it doesn't have the walls of the pit to hold it into shape, you might have thought that's called moving. So therefore the chiddush is that this top water is also um, considered also resting, and therefore you are in violation of uprooting. You got it? This is how we're explaining the Gemara. We'll have to see if others explain differently. But we're explaining the Gemara's answer is we're talking about the water that's actually a little above the the top layer, which is resting above the rim of the pit, and that has more movement because there's no walls holding it in, and you might have thought that because it moves a little bit, that movement, you might have thought that it's not considered resting. So that's why the chidush is kamash malan. That's why we're telling us that it's considered resting. And the Gemara says, "V'ozda Rava l'tamei." Rava is going according to his reasoning. The Amar Rava. Rava says when you have mayim al gabe mayim, water on top of water, that's considered hainu hanachata. That's considered resting. Even though there might be some movement, you might see the water, top layer of water moving. See over here, they explain it. The upper layer of a body of water is not, you might have thought that the upper layer is not considered resting. And Rav is saying, and Rav says, no, we do consider when water is on top of water, even though there might be some movement in that upper layer, but that's called resting. But egos al gabe mayim. But let's say if you have a nut, you put a walnut, and the walnut, and you placed in a pool of water. Let's say you have a pit, and then you place the walnut into that pit. Let's say your friend was keeping walnuts, and the walnuts were floating on that pit of water. So that's not the fact that walnut, that movement of the walnut floating is not considered resting. That's not, we don't look at the walnut as resting. When water on top of water, it's all one, we look at it as one, even though there might be a little bit movement in that top layer of water, but we look at the water as one entity. And therefore the water is one entity, and just like the bottom water is resting, we'll consider the top water as part of that. It's not a flowing river. It's just like I said, it's a pit of water where you have water on top. You have the lower layer of water, the upper layer of water in that pit. So that whole pit is considered, that whole guma is considered one body of water, which is resting. And if a person would take the water from that pit and take it outside, he would be violating. However, we don't look one anymore. We don't look at the nut and the water as one entity. If you have a walnut floating in a pit of water, that walnut is considered not resting. And if you go ahead and you stick your hand into that pit that has that walnut and you of water, and the walnut is floating in that pit of water, there would be a violation of there would not be a violation because it's not considered it was resting, right? In order for you to be a violation of Shabbat, like Simon said before, it has to be an akira. Having an akira means to uproot something that something's resting. But if it's not resting, it's not an akira. You're not uprooting anything. So that's what the Gemara is saying. It's not considered resting. And therefore, if a person uproots the walnut, it's considered that he didn't violate the Torah prohibition of taking something from private property to public because the item was not resting, it was floating. And now, Boi Rava. Rava asked a very interesting question. Egos Bikli. Let's say you had a nut and you put a nut in a cup. Okay? And then the Kli Tsafa Gabe Mayim. And the utensil was floating on that water. You had a cup. Let's say you had this pit of water and you put a cup with a nut in it and it's moving in the water. And now if you're going to take the cup out of the water, right? So the cup is not resting, but the cup is moving, it's floating in the water. But now you have the walnut that's in the cup. The walnut is just staying still. It's moving with the cup. So Tosfos points out, good morning, that's called moving. That's called moving because it's true. The nut itself is not, it's the cup that's moving, but the walnut's in the cup and that's moving. But nevertheless, the Gemara's question is, was that the way, did they store things when you want to put something, when they wanted to put things away by the Mishkan? How did they store things? And if in those times, if this would be a way of putting things away, if you would put something in a utensil, if this would be considered the normal way of storing, so maybe that's called, it's resting, it's at rest. So that's the Gemara's question. The Gemara wants to know, Bata egos azlinan, do we go after the nut and v'hanayach? The nut is resting in the utensil. It's just that the utensil is moving. The nut is not not on its own. The nut is not moving on its own. Or dilma, or perhaps, bata kliyazlina. We go after the utensil, and the utensil is moving. V'holonayach, and the utensil is not resting. The night it's moving on top of the water. So what's the halacha regarding such a situation? So the Gemara says, teku. The Gemara does not answer this question. So if you look at if you look in the art scroll, let's see if they they don't mention anything much more about it. Okay, so that was the Gemara's question, and we have to wait till Eliyahu Hanavi comes to answer this question. You know, sometimes, the Gemara says teku, and which is an acronym, about Tishbi with Yuturetz, the Tishbi. Eliyahu Hanavi will answer all the kashas and the different questions that we have. So we have to wait for that clarification of that. I want to wish everyone a beautiful day. Yes, that's up.
Shalom.
Take care, Ralph.
The fact that there's something inside.
something that's
The
inside,
question is, what is the thing that came there?
right, and that item inside that utensil, is that considered resting? But it itself is not moving on its own. It's like station, like you, it's like, right. In itself, you go into a rowboat, you say you go into a boat, and the boat moves, but you're not moving on your own. You yourself are just staying still. That seems like, now, Tosa says that's called moving. You're actually moving. But the question was, if that's the way that people actually store, if you would store something in such a fashion, this is how you would, if you want to put something down, you want to place something down, if you would place it in a utensil. Let's say if that's how you would store nuts, by placing in this type of situation, so maybe that's called resting, because that's how you store it. So maybe that's called, it's put down. If that's the norm of putting it down, meaning maybe that's the possibility that we might view it that it's in its norm, it's in its resting place, even though it's actually moving. But the fact that that's, if that's the way, what's the status of the what?
It's not. It's.
Right. Right. That's the question. Have a great day. A beautiful Shabbat.